This is the new CaddX Walksnail Goggles X. Now, it is well known that simply by putting the letter X in your product title makes it at least that much better than the competition. Today, we're going to be finding out, though, how much better this is than the original Avatar HD goggles, but also goggles like the DJI Goggles 2 and the HDZeros. Now, this is a very long video. We're going to do an overview of the goggles. We're going to walk you through the features, the changes, do a bit of a teardown, walk you through the I/O and its features, and then at the end, I'm going to share with you my thoughts. There will be chapter marks below on this video, so if you do want to jump to any section, please feel free to do so. It has been a mammoth task for me to be able to put this video together, but hopefully by the end of it, you will have an idea of not only if these goggles are for you, but what has changed compared to the others. Anyway, let's get on with it and let's find out what these are all about. Okay, so to start, we'll do a very quick unboxing. It looks like this. On the back, it shows you a picture of the goggles, as well as what you get included, which is a set of goggles, foam padding, cloth, user manual, power cable, and a box for the goggles as well. Now, just showing you how all of this comes packaged inside. It separates like a bit of a jewelry box, actually, top to bottom. Come on, get off. And then inside you'll find the goggles. They still include them in this nice sort of soft padded carry case. Inside this you'll find the goggles themselves, and then in the top we have our leaflet, we have our cleaning cloth and our power cable. Now, one last thing I just want to show you on the case is the fact that you can put the goggles in with the included antennas pre-fitted. You don't need to remove them. It's not a major feature, but it's a real nice little attention to detail that just makes life a little bit easier overall. Now, before I give you an overview of the goggles, I just want to talk about price, because CaddX have told me these goggles are going to retail for $459, or roughly €530. Now, that is extremely competitive considering what we're getting here, and is certainly going to put it up against goggles like the HDZeros as well as the DJIs, and actually that has come in much lower than I was personally anticipating, and I think that is going to make things very interesting moving forward. Okay, so jumping straight into the goggles. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that they are a completely new design. They're made of plastic. We have this sort of grey metallic plastic on the top and around the bottom, and then on the front you've got these shiny areas here with these LED bars located there, and we'll talk about that a bit more later on. And then we've got our antennas located in the corners. Now, I'm going to walk you through the main spec and features, and I'll talk about my opinion on them at the end of the video when I give you a breakdown of my findings having spent time with them. Now, with regards to the specs of the goggles, the displays and everything, it is pretty much the same as the original goggle with regards to Avatar HD. So, these goggles have dual 1080p OLED displays up to 100 Hz. They have a 50-degree field of view with an IPD range of 54 to 74, and they have a +2 to -6 diopter. They feature all of the main controls and options that we have on the original Avatar goggle. So we have a joystick at the top, a back button and a record. And from an Avatar HD point of view, pretty much everything is the same. It supports Avatar HD in both the 1080p and 720p modes, 720p up to 100 frames a second, 1080p up to 100 frames a second. However, that's a new mode, which I will talk about a bit more later on. Now, whilst things are the same on Avatar HD, there are some big differences with regards to the I/O, because on the bottom of these goggles you will find not only an HDMI output, and that is a mini HDMI port rather than the USB-C, we actually have HDMI input as well, meaning that you can use these goggles with other systems, including the likes of HDZero on their VRX module. Alongside HDMI input, there is also an analog CVBS input as well. This is a 3.5mm jack. There is no bay on these goggles, so if you did want to connect them to analog, you can, but you're going to need to do it with a manual plug there. These goggles do still have a built-in DVR for the Avatar HD system. You have an SD card located there for that. However, that doesn't work with HDMI or analog. That only works on Avatar HD. One of the nice new features on the new Goggles X is the fact that it has built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. At the point of me making this video though, I'm not able to demonstrate this because it isn't available yet. CaddX have said they're going to release an app in the future that will allow you to connect to your goggles, download footage directly from them, and even upgrade the firmware. Now, we don't fully know what other features and capabilities that app is going to add. Will we be able to have live view? I simply don't know, and I'm looking forward to CaddX sharing more information on this in the future. Alongside that Wi-Fi and Bluetooth functionality, there is also a built-in gyro sensor on these goggles. But again, at the point of me making this video, there is no functionality available for that. There's nothing I can do to demonstrate that, and hopefully CaddX are going to release some features around that in the future. Hopefully that means we will get things like head tracking, and it'll be interesting to see how they develop that as time goes on. These goggles now also feature a built-in proximity sensor where the old SD card was on the other goggles. That is used to allow the goggles to turn the displays on and off automatically. About the only other big change on the goggle compared to the original is the fact that there is no longer a power switch on these goggles. There is the DC input jack on the side, but there is no dedicated power button, and to turn these on and off you simply have to plug in or unplug the power cable like you had to do on some other goggles in the past. Something you may have noticed when I was talking about the voltage spec on these goggles was the fact I said 6S. The original Avatar goggles actually only supported up to 5S or 22 volts, and whilst you could use them on 6S, it came with a risk, and some people did end up burning out their goggles. However, CaddX have rectified that now with these goggles, and they do have official support for 2 to 6S input voltages. Now, just giving you an overview of the rest of the goggle itself, you'll see on this side here, there is a grill. That is where there is an internal cooling fan dragging air in. You will then see air come out of the bottom here by the nose piece, and there's also vents on the top up here where it will expel air as well. With regards to the anti-fog system on this goggle, they have gone down the DJI approach. There is no vents or anything in the middle, and what you have is a vent in each corner, pretty much identical to what DJI have done on the goggles too, and I will share with you my thoughts later on how well that actually performs. The foam on these goggles is also different compared to what we had on the original. It's more like what DJI have on the goggles too in the Integra. It's not mounted on a plastic piece, it is just held on with Velcro. However, it is this sort of sponge foam effect. It goes all the way around the top. It's quite thick, and then you've got this nose piece here that goes in the middle, rather than it being that sort of fake leather mask that we had on the original goggle. It is easily replaceable though, so you can just peel it off, and I'm guessing you're going to find others available from the likes of CaddX as well as other manufacturers in the future as well. Pretty much everything on this goggle is brand new, from the design right through to the strap, the foam, and everything else. What is nice to see is that they have improved the antenna layout on these goggles compared to the originals. Again, it's more like the DJI V2 goggles, with them being on the corner there, and that is much better than we had before. If I unscrew the antenna, they are on ports, they are removable, exactly the same as we had on the previous goggle, RP-SMA, and you could replace these for any other type of antenna that you wanted to use. Now, one last thing I just want to talk about on antennas is replacing these LED plates with patch antennas, for instance. Now, when you first look at these, you may not think that they actually come off, but they will. What you need to do is get yourself like a plastic pry tool. If you pop it in the top there, you will see that you can actually pop off the front cover. The wire for the LEDs goes into the front. You are going to need to remove this top cover and remove the LED connections if you did want to replace these, but this means that there is the opportunity to remove the front covers on either side. You can see they've also included some screw holes here, and there'll be another one on this side here, so there is going to be a patch antenna setup available for this in the future, whether that be from CaddX themselves or third parties. So there are some nice options around that, and even that could be used for mounting something like a patch antenna and an analog module bay as well. Now, As I mentioned at the start, on the front of these goggles, you have these two little LED bars, and these actually are the status LED for the goggle whilst in use. When you power the goggles up, you will see that they first come on and show all of the colours that are available, and then they jump to the colour that you have set in the menu. Now, at the moment, the only options that you have on these LEDs is to change the colour itself. There's no options to do things like have independent addressable options. I'd love it if CaddX allowed you to do things like Now, to be able to change the setting on these, what you do is just go into the menu, and then you go across to the main goggles settings, under device, and under here you will find options for LED color, and you can scroll through and set it from red to green to blue, and then to close, which turns them off, and then you can go back to red. With regards to the optics, I'll talk later on about my experience with them, but the adjustment setup is really straightforward. You've got your IPD simply by sliding in and out. It's really quite stiff, so you're not going to have any problems with that moving. And then you've got your focus adjustment simply by turning, pretty much the same as what we've seen on many other sets of goggles. That is pretty much everything to show you on the goggle itself. About the only other thing to say is that there is a new head strap, sort of has this fake leather strap to there, and then you've got the elastic bit at the back, and then that comes around there. It's not terrible, it's not the best in the world, and then that attaches to the integrated hoop on the side. If you are going to want to swap this out for another strap, you're going to need one that can go through, or at least you're going to need one that you're going to be able to put a bracket on there to be able to swap it out. There's no cutouts on the hoops at all. Now, when I was showing you around these goggles, you may have noticed that this center area here on the top of the goggle looks like it's removable, and that is because it is. CaddX have added this removable panel that allows you to get to the board below, allowing for simple future upgrades. Now, we'll take a closer look at this later on in the video when we tear the goggles down. At this moment in time, there are no upgrades available for it, but it is a feature CaddX have added just to try and offer a bit more longevity to the goggle, but this is obviously going to rely on them making upgrade boards available in the future. Now, when it comes to the native Avatar HD spec on these goggles, as I've mentioned already, everything is pretty much the same. However, if you look at the specs on these goggles, they actually show them supporting 1080p up to 100 frames a second. That is for the displays, but it is also listed under the RF capabilities as well. Now, in the test firmware that I've got for these goggles, the 1080p 100 frames a second mode is actually active. I've taken it for a few flights, and overall I have to say it looks very, very nice. It isn't, though, fully working in the sense of when I look at the bottom, the range finding feature isn't working, but the overall image quality looks decent. Latency isn't quite as low as it is in the 720p high frame rate mode, but it certainly is better than the 1080p normal mode, and it's nice to see that CaddX are working on this. I will do some specific latency testing on this in the future, and as I've said, we'll be covering this in a separate video. One question people will have on these new goggles with regards to Avatar HD is antenna transmission. On the original goggles, they only transmitted from one port, and I can confirm that is exactly the same on the new Goggles X. However, it isn't the same antenna. On the original one, it would transmit from this port over here, whereas on these antennas, it is transmitting from this one. Now, I have put this screenshot together just to explain it in a bit more detail. This means, depending on your flying style, you will need to choose what type of antenna to put on the ports. For instance, if you're flying long range, you're going to want to make sure you get a patch antenna on that one there, or if you're flying close range and more around yourselves, you're going to want to make sure there's an Omni on it. The other three ports are exactly the same as they were before, receive only, and from an RF point of view, nothing has really changed on the Avatar HD side of things. Next, we're going to do a quick comparison on the new Goggles X compared to the original Avatar HD goggle, as well as the DJI Goggle 2. Now, I'm not going to compare them to the likes of the DJI V1s or V2s. We all know that they are a much larger goggle. The really interesting thing is how these stack up from a size and weight point of view compared to these two. If we compare them, first of all, to the original Walksnail Avatar goggle, you can see that there is a bit of a difference in size. These are definitely a more boxier goggle, more like what we had from DJI on the goggles too, and we'll compare them in a second. You can see that they definitely are narrower front to back than the Walksnail goggle, but it's a completely different size and shape. It has much less of a curve on the new goggle than on the original one. If I just flip them over underneath, again, you can see the differences. No power button on the new goggle, as I've mentioned, but we do have focus and IPD adjustment. They're both located underneath. If we look at the optics and the lenses, let me just pop that there and then move the strap on this one to the side. You will see that they are not the same. It is an entirely new set of optics on these goggles compared to the original one. The original optics don't carry over. Obviously, the displays on this goggle are the same resolution as these ones, but we don't know if it's the same display itself. But the optics have changed and they have completely redesigned them, and they are saying that they are improved over the original goggle. Comparing it next to a set of DJI goggles too, you can see size-wise they are bigger. Really, these goggles sit in size between the original Avatar goggle and the DJI Goggle 2. Similar though overall, but they are smaller, the DJIs, they are shorter, and really DJI did an amazing job of making these as small as possible. However, DJI absolutely ended up with some compromises on these goggles, and stay with this video later to find out if Walksnail have ended up doing the same. Now, as I did compare these to the DJI, I do want to quickly do the same on the HDZero. You can see side by side, the Avatar goggle is quite a bit smaller actually. It's not only narrower, it isn't as deep either. I think it's about the same, might be a little bit narrower. There really isn't a lot in it, and it is a completely different design between the two. Obviously, HDZero goggle has built itself up on having all of the extra compatibility, things like that rail system on the front for the additional antennas, but there's no reason you wouldn't be able to do something on these. Whilst there isn't a rail there, you could absolutely 3D print a top panel that is going to give you extra capabilities, and I really don't think there's a lot between these two when it comes to overall functionality. And again, that choice is going to come down to the system you use rather than the goggle. Comparing these goggles weight-wise, if we take a look at the Avatar original goggles first of all. Now, I don't have antennas fitted on these goggles at the moment. If we add 2 antennas on from there, you can see it's at 312. If we put 2 on, you can see it's gone to 321. You're getting about 9 grams, 10 grams for the antenna. So about 330 is probably where the original Avatar goggles sit with their antennas. If we then move over to the new Goggles X with antennas fitted, you can see it's coming in at 317, so it's definitely lighter than the original Avatar goggle. And then if we move over to the DJI Goggles 2, that comes in at 306. That is with the G2 flip antennas on board. So again, the Avatar Goggle X comes in midpoint, lighter than the original goggle, but not quite as light as the DJI Goggle 2. Software-wise, these goggles are pretty much identical to the original Avatar HD goggles. There is no redesign of the UI. If you take a look at the menus, it has all of the same layout and options as the original one. So you have your main channel page, that moves across into your spectator mode, then across to your settings, and then over to the playback. There are no major changes on the menu side of things. I'm not going to go into a deep dive of every single option in this video, but it is basically the same as we had on the V1s. The only changes are that they've added a couple of extra options, such as an on and off button for the built-in proximity sensor. With regards to swapping these goggles between the different modes, i.e. Avatar HD, HDMI input or analog, that isn't actually done by the menus, and that's done via the buttons on the top. To swap between the different modes, you simply press and hold the back button for a few seconds, and you will hear the goggles actually make a beep, and they will then switch between the different modes. Now, to demonstrate this, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the HDMI input as well as the capability on HDMI output, showing you how you switch through the different modes as well. Okay, so the setup for this is as follows. We've got the Goggles X connected via HDMI output here to my capture card. That is what you're seeing in the bottom right hand corner. So for instance, if I go into the Avatar HD menu, you can see that appearing down there. We also then have a HDZero receiver connected to the Avatar HD goggles via HDMI in. So we have both the HDMI in and out connected at the same time. And what I'm going to demonstrate is the fact that you can not only use the HDMI inputs to see on the goggles, but you can pass that through whilst seeing the image on the goggles as well, allowing you to do external DVR recording. So what we're going to do is come out of the HD menu and go into the next mode. This is going to be analog. We don't actually have anything connected on analog on this at the moment, but what you're going to see is the white noise come up on the screen, again just demonstrating that HDMI output works. We're then going to switch and move over to the HDMI input, and next you should see my HDZero receiver appear on the screen. There it is. If I then hop out of that and go into the main menu, you can see that we do have all of the options for HDZero, and it's just displaying it exactly like you would expect on any normal HDMI input. Just to give a bit more detail on the HDMI input and output capability. Output mirrors what the goggles are set to. So that is exactly the same as the VRX in the sense of if you have Avatar HD set to low latency mode, the HDMI output will be 100 frames a second. If you have it in normal latency mode, it will be 60 frames a second. It mirrors whatever the displays are set to. The HDMI input also supports full 100 frames a second as well. I have tested it with the Avatar HD VRX module on low latency mode and it works absolutely fine. What's also interesting is if you're using the HDMI in and out at the same time, it basically mirrors. So if you have 100 frames a second on the HDMI input, you will get 100 frames a second on the HDMI output as well, because you can use them simultaneously. Overall, the HDMI behavior on this seems pretty good. There are a few times where it does black screen and I've had to unplug the cable and plug it back in, but overall it seems a lot more reliable than the USB-C that we had on the original Avatar goggle. Now with regards to the analog on these goggles, as I've said, it's got a 3.5mm jack. There is no module bay or anything like that. However, there is no reason you couldn't 3D print your own top cover that has an analog module bay built in, although you are going to have to be careful and take into account the thermal considerations because there is the vents here. Under this part is the main RF board and there's quite a lot of heat here, like I'll show you later on in the video. But you could make your own top cover and have an analog bay coming down the front of the goggle, and I think we're going to see some nice mods around this in the future. I have done some testing on the analog input in the workshop and overall it seems to perform fine. It is displayed as 4:3 on both the screens as well as the HDMI output. Now there are no controls or options for the analog display on these goggles. You cannot adjust the brightness, you cannot adjust the settings. All of that is actually done via the main Avatar HD screen and that is then replicated onto the analog display. What's a big shame on the analog input is that you do not have DVR. As I mentioned earlier, the DVR on these goggles only works on the Avatar HD system. It does not work with HDMI or the analog input. And if you did want to be able to record your input, unfortunately, you're going to have to do that with an external device. As I understand it, this isn't something that CaddX will be able to change in the future. Unfortunately, it's not something they can add via firmware, and as a result of that, you're going to need to use another device if you do want to be able to record the analog footage. Now, I've done a bunch of input latency testing on the new Goggles X for the analog input, and I've compared that to the likes of the HDZeros, the Skyzone 04Xs, as well as the DJI V2s. Looking at the chart, you will see there is no question that both the Skyzone 04Xs and the HDZero goggles offer close to zero additional latency over what you get in analog, with them averaging 1 to 2 milliseconds for first pixel and around 18 milliseconds for a full frame. The DJI V2s are averaging 16.5 milliseconds for the first pixel and 33 milliseconds for a full frame. If we then look at the Avatar Goggles X, they are coming in at a higher number on the average first pixel number, but the same with regards to full frame. What I can say is the DJI Goggles V2 and the Avatar Goggles work very differently in how they actually deliver the image to the screen. All of the OLED goggles deliver the image progressively from top to bottom, whereas the DJI V2s deliver the image in segments with the bottom of the screen filling first and then the top coming afterwards. What I will say from my observations is, whilst the Avatar goggles do look like they offer a little higher latency with regards to first pixel, they should offer overall very similar performance to the DJI Goggles V2, and actually you may even find it feels a little bit quicker simply as a result of the way that image comes in. The V2s do have some very high outliers with regards to the latency. Whilst at times you can get the first pixel in as low as 14 milliseconds, it can actually be as high as 28 milliseconds when you're waiting for the display to refresh, and it certainly isn't linear in the way it delivers the image, whereas the other three OLED goggles are. And what I would say is, whilst the Avatar goggles are certainly not at the level of the O4Xs or the HDZeros with regards to input latency on analog, they should offer a smoother experience over the V2. Now, with regards to those other modes, there is one thing I do need to bring up, and that is the RF behavior of Avatar when you are in those other modes. At the point of me making this video, I found an issue that the Avatar HD system is transmitting all of the time in all of the modes. Even when you switch to the likes of analog, the Avatar HD RF is still active, and for instance, you're going to have a 10 megs carrier transmitting at a minimum of 25 milliwatts on whatever the last channel the Avatar system was set to. This is obviously a potentially big issue for analog users because your own goggle is transmitting on the same set of frequencies that you will be using for your analog reception, and it is going to cause people some big issues. Now, I have spoke to CaddX about this, and they are going to resolve this in a future firmware update. At the point of me making this video, it hasn't been fixed. However, they have said they will change that in the future, and that is something that hopefully will solve the issue for people. It isn't something I'm going to call a deal breaker because they are going to fix it, but at the point of me making this video, it is a problem and it is something I wanted to highlight. As I've already said, at the end of this video, I will share with you my thoughts having spent some time with these goggles, share with you my opinion on the optics, the behavior, the features, and really what I think they're like, not only compared to the original Avatar goggles, but the likes of the DJI goggles too. Before we do that though, we're going to do a quick teardown. We're going to take a look at these goggles inside. I'm then going to move on to a bit more detail on the RF side of things, what's changed, and then we will take a look at some thermal testing to give you an idea of how these goggles actually look thermally, because there's quite a bit of heat coming out of these and I want to demonstrate that to you, and then I will share with you my thoughts. So the first thing I'm going to need to do is remove the face mask. Now this is nice and easy because it's simply held in place with Velcro. Now what you'll see once you remove it is that two screws are actually visible. However, if you remove the Velcro, you will find that there are a bunch more hiding below. Once you remove the Velcro, you can see that it reveals a bunch of additional screws. You've got another 2, 4, 6, 7 screws that you have access to that you need to remove to get inside the goggles. Now, what's interesting is these two here, you do need to remove them, but they are the only two that hold this top panel on. And you can actually remove them and gain access to this top area without actually removing this back face mask. And I'll talk about that a bit more at the end of the video. Now, I'm not going to show you on film how to actually release the face mask, but once you remove the screws like we did, what you then need to do is actually unclip it all the way around. There are clips down here. You need to get in there with a plastic pry tool very carefully, release it, and then that will allow that face mask to fall away. So you can see now I've got the mask off. We have that proximity sensor located here. There's a little wire going down into the rest of the goggle. That's what's going to detect when the goggles are on your head or face and turn the OLEDs on or off. I've got the face mask off and you can now see inside. Now these goggles are a completely different animal to the originals, and in fact they are very similar to the DJI Goggles 2 in how they're put together. What we've got over this side here is a fan that seems to be blowing air just into the main cavity area of the goggles. I can't see any duct on that fan at all. It just looks to be blowing horizontally to the right. We've obviously got our lenses in the middle with our optics and our screens down the back below. And then on the right hand side, we've got two PCBs. We've got one which is going to be the power board with the DC jack on the side, and then we've got some I/O. There's the SD card on the backboard, and then the HDMI in and out on the other one. There is also a board at the front of these goggles that I can see as well. I can see an IC down there. And then there is definitely another board along here at the top as well. Now I'm intrigued what is on that board at the back compared to this board up here. I can't tell which is the RF board, although I can see a UFL connector on that one there. What we'll try and do is get this top cover off in a minute. Just to show you down into the optics, you can see them there. If I move them in and out, you can see that they slide on rails. Very similar to what we've seen from other manufacturers. You've then got the adjustment for the IPD, as I've just shown, and then the focus there, which moves a part of the lens in and out. Now, just going in a bit closer, you can see that board down the back end there. It's quite hard to see through the optics, but you can see the PCB at the back. There's definitely quite a large IC on that one behind the optics. And then if I move over to the side there, you can see the one power board on then the I/O board for the HDMI. We've then got that board at the top there. And just to show you the fan in a bit more detail, really not that easy to demonstrate, but it is located down there. No ducting, as I've said, it's just blowing straight into the goggles. Okay, now I've unclipped this top cover. There are some clips along the front, and then there's the two screws at the back that go into the face mask that release it. You can see there is an antenna on the top here. We'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. And then you can see that we've got the main PCB. This has this heat shield over the top, which will pop off in a minute. We can see we've got a USB port, a couple of wires there, and I can see some antenna wires coming in either side. So what we'll do is get that off and take a look at what we find underneath. Looking around this top board, what we've got is our main SoC here. Now, nothing has changed on that. It is the same SoC, and then we've got our two RAM chips here. I've decided not to remove the heat compound. I don't feel there's a great need to at this moment in time. We know pretty much everything that's going on here because it's a very similar layout to what we had on the V1 board. That then comes over to our two RF transceivers. We've then got our power amplifier. It's the same setup on this board as it was on the original. You have 4 antennas, 3 are receive and 1 is transmit. That is that one there. So it looks like it's going to be one of them on this side of the goggle that's transmit. We've then got some additional circuitry like our battery, and we do then have something new, which is this little board down here, which is our Wi-Fi board. Now this is actually soldered onto the main PCB. You can see the antenna for this heads off over there, and the antenna on that is simply stuck to the bottom of the top cover. Just bring it in view there to allow it to get the best signal. Okay, so I've disconnected all of the antennas now, as well as the 2 wires up here for the LEDs. So we then simply have one more screw located here to undo, and then we can lift up the board. Now, once you lift the board up, you will see that there are 2 connections going into the goggle. We've got this ribbon cable down here, as well as this cable up here. Now, this is one of those ones where you have to carefully flip up the lever. That will release the cable and allow you to pop it out. It is not the same type of connector as we had on the V1 goggle. It is a little bit more difficult. You may find a little bit of tape over the top of yours like that there. That was on mine just now. I just removed it, so you'd need to remove that first, flip the lever, and then release it. Once that ribbon cable is disconnected, you can then fold it over, and you've then got one more cable here. Now, this is pretty much the same type of cable that they use on their camera connection. It's got the lugs on either side, so what you do is simply carefully peel it up at the edge to release it. That will then pop free and release the board. And that there just shows you the empty module bay. Again, as I've said, it's not really crazily modular compared to what we had before. It's a little easier to get to, but there really isn't a lot in it. Okay, so I've got the board out now. You can see the top of the chipsets there. I'm not going to remove the heat compound at this point. I will have images up on repair.wiki, and I will talk about the ICs on this in a little bit more detail later on. And then just to flip it over to the back, you can then see the rear of the board with our two connections, which is one like that camera connector over here, and one up here, which is that ribbon cable. Now, whilst they are saying that this board is modular, removable, I'll be honest, it's not really any easier than the board on the original Goggle. Whilst you've got 2 screws to remove the top panel, pretty much everything else is the same. On the original Goggle, you only actually had to remove 4 screws, undo 4 UFLs, 2 ribbon cables and a power cable, and you could take the board out as well. Whilst they're calling it modular, I'm not buying into the fact that it is completely modular. It isn't actually that much different to the original V1 goggles. Now, I'm not going to go in any further than this at this point in time. These goggles are completely different to take apart compared to the originals. Obviously, there is additional boards, as I've shown, at the back down there, and then we've got the boards down here, which is our I/O for our HDMI and everything else. There is clearly additional things going on inside. However, I don't feel the need at this moment in time, at the least, to go in that far. Now, just to show you a few of my findings from under the microscope, here you can see the top of the main SoC. It is exactly the same as all of the others. They've masked it so we can't see the labeling. However, we know from the firmware it is the same. There is nothing changed on that side of things. Looking in closer at the other parts of the board, you can see the PA as well as the receive amplifiers, and we have the usual IE2000 chipset like we've seen on all the other versions. What has changed though, obviously, is the additional Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and as a result of that, we now have this chipset. This is what is providing that connectivity, and again, we'll see functionality around that in the future. And I did manage to get in and have a look at what that chipset was in the back, and that is the HDMI switch chipset that's providing that I/O functionality. Now, the last thing I just want to show you is thermals. These goggles do seem to get quite hot in use, so what I've done is put them under the thermal camera, and I want to show you the results of that next. Looking at these goggles thermally, you will see there's a very clear path on the airflow. It comes in on this side here, and you can then see that it is being blown through the goggles and then expelled at the vents at the bottom of the front ahead of your nose, or at the vents on the top, with the left hand vent here definitely showing the most. If we then look at the port side of things, you can see there is heat around there, and you can see where that heat is being expelled from those vents underneath. In the mask area, you can see on the left-hand side closest to the fan, the vent through is cold, but the right-hand side is showing a lot warmer, and also a lot of heat in that top area as well, around where that main PCB is. Overall, things are clearly separated into 2 halves. The one side with the fan is keeping cool, whereas the other side is definitely getting hotter. Okay, so to quickly summarise before I share with you my thoughts, we have a new set of goggles from CaddX Walksnail designed for the Avatar HD system. They support 1080p OLED displays up to 100Hz, and that is reflected in the system support up to 100 frames a second in 1080p as well. It has the onboard DVR for Avatar HD, and really, from the Avatar side of things, everything is pretty much the same. These goggles now have proper HDMI output rather than USB-C, but they now also have HDMI input as well, which supports up to 100 frames a second. They have a 3.5mm analog CVBS analog input, and they have some nice little extra features like the LEDs on the front. Whilst the displays are the same resolution as the original goggle, they do have a larger field of view, and it is an entirely new optic system. So, to share with you my thoughts on these goggles. Now, there is a lot to cover here, and I'm going to split it into separate sections. First of all, externally and the hardware side of things, I really like them. The fitment on the face is okay. It's not the best I've had, and it's not the worst, but they're not uncomfortable. The weight of these goggles is nice, having shown you earlier that they do come in between the original Avatar goggle and the DJI, and from an external point of view, everything is pretty good. There are some odd things on this goggle when you first look at them. This front plate looks out of place because it doesn't necessarily look like it fits 100% correct, but that is because it's removable. When you look at the line along the front, you can see there's a little bit of a step, but that is as a result of that panel being able to come off. Also, the fact that there's what looks to be a power button on the side next to the power input, but it's just a symbol to signify that is the power input, also will catch you out as well. It makes you think that it looks like a touchpad, but it isn't. It is simply just a symbol to state that is the power, but they've used the symbol for a power button, not the symbol for DC input. That removable panel on the top is rather interesting because it does hint that CaddX could be working on something new from a system point of view, but we're going to have to wait and see what that is. However, it is nice that they've thought enough ahead to integrate an option of upgrade on these goggles, which should mean that you wouldn't have to rush out and get a new set of goggles if they were to release a version 2 system in the future. Moving on to the RF systems, as I've already said, it's pretty much what we had before. Single transmit, 3 receive. The only thing I will say on this compared to the other system is they have actually made some improvements with regards to the behavior of the avatar system and the blinking OSD. In my testing, it definitely seems more stable. It isn't perfect. It does still blink a little bit now and again, but for me, it was noticeably better on these goggles, the blinking OSD performance compared to the originals. Now, I don't know, is that specific to this goggle, or is that in the new firmware that we may see coming to the original goggles in the near future? But I can say that they've definitely made an improvement in that respect. Also, that 1080p mode in 100 frames a second looks really nice. I'm looking forward to talking about that a little bit more in the future, and it's nice to see that finally start to come through. And really, on the avatar side of things, you're not getting a night and day experience boost compared to the original goggle, but you are getting something that does give you a lot more options. Moving on to the HDMI input, there's not a lot I could say really other than it works. No complaints there at all. And the analog is pretty much the same, 4:3. The only downside is that you don't have DVR. There is no way of recording on these goggles what you're seeing. So if that is important to you, it is going to be a big downer. Moving on to the face fit and the optics, and unfortunately this is where for me things get a little bit disappointing. CaddX have said that they have completely redesigned the optics system on these goggles to improve clarity, and whilst that may be the case, I'm actually getting some issues very similar to what I get on the DJI goggles too. They have increased that field of view to 50 degrees, which is nice, but I am seeing blurring at the corners, vignetting, and blurring specifically around the OSD at the bottom. Unfortunately, no amount of tuning that I do gets rid of that, and at the moment it is a bit of a downside for me on these goggles compared to the originals. The V1 avatar goggle were optically perfect for me and probably one of the best goggles I have used in that respect. Unfortunately, these fall into the same category for me as the DJI goggles too. Now, this does cause a few downsides in flight because some of the OSD icons are right at the corner at the bottom, and it is the bottom of the display I find worse than the top, and it means I can't necessarily see things like the signal bars on the Avatar HD system. I have fed this back to CaddX, and I've asked about being able to move some of the OSD items around for the goggle side of things. I'm not particularly worried about not being able to see the bottom 2 corners in the goggles, but what is a problem is that I can't see the OSD elements for the battery voltage of the goggle or the signal very easily. I am seeing glaring off the avatar menu system and some of the OSD elements along the bottom, but messing with the face fitment does tend to help with that. Something that is interesting though is that the DJI face masks for the goggles too will fit the new Goggles X from Walksnail absolutely perfectly. So you can actually mess around with some of the face masks. There's a whole range of them on the market already. I've been testing the iFlight ones and they actually fit this really well, and the thicker face mask for me actually helps. What I'm finding on these goggles is I actually need to bring the bottom out a little bit, and that helps me get a good view of the bottom of the display, and the iFlight thick face mask is helping to do that for me. I have no complaints of the quality of the screens themselves. The OLEDs look absolutely perfect and the overall performance of the optics is fairly good, although I have noticed this strange line inside which looks to be like a top of something that you can just see above the displays, which isn't straight. I'm going to try and get it on camera to show you. I don't know if I can, and what you see is this line above the display, but it's not horizontally level, and it's a little bit distracting if you spot it. For me, these are not the best goggle optically, however, they're certainly not the worst either. My favourites are the Skyzone 04Xs as well as the Avatar V1s. I would put these in third place, with the Orca FPV1 pilots in fourth, and then the DJI Goggles 2 in 10th. The Goggles 2 from DJI for me are as bad as it gets. I get lots of vignetting, lots of blurring around the OSD, overlapping on the image no matter what I do, and they are just uncomfortable. They put pressure on my nose and I even struggle to breathe with them. The Orca FPV1 pilots are okay, but I see a lot of tunneling effect on the optics and lots of reflections, as well as some vignetting. And whilst I am getting vignetting on these and blurring on the OSD image at the bottom, it isn't as bad as the other goggles, and that's why I have put them in third place. Optics is always a very subjective issue. What works for me may not work for you, and what works for you may not work for me. They're certainly not terrible, and whilst I have a few little things, it isn't something that is a deal breaker for me, and hopefully with some tweaks to the software to allow me to move things around, I'll be able to get around the issues that I do have. On that final note though, CaddX have said that there will be options available on optics for people to buy in the future. You may be able to change the lenses, so that might be something I can change physically that way, but today that isn't available. The final thing to talk about in that face area is the Antifog. Now, I have had quite varying results on this so far. It isn't summer here, so I can't tell you exactly how good it is, but I do have some concerns. Unlike on the V1 goggle where you did have dedicated ducting, these have the same setup as the DJIs where they have some vents at the sides. What they're doing, as I've showed you already, is they're bringing cool air in from the side. That is simply being pumped into the main cavity area inside the goggle, and as a result of that positive pressure, you're then getting the airflow come out through the vent at the bottom, come out at the vents at the top as it's passing over that top PCB, because there's a little area for the air to get in, and it also then will come out of that face mask area at the side. So far, I don't think the anti-fog mechanism on this is very good. I need to do more testing, but I have a horrible feeling based on what I've seen so far that in summer I'm going to be coming up against some real issues again. It is too early though to fully know the situation. What I can't say is that they've done an amazing job of putting a really good anti-fog mechanism in, and what I can say is there is potential here for issues. However, that doesn't mean there isn't anything we can do about it. That front vent down there could be blocked to help increase the pressure and push the airflow elsewhere, and there is these little grills over the top of the vents in the goggles area that you could remove that should help with more airflow. I have spoke to CaddX about this, and I have actually asked about an option of having a boost function on the joystick that when you press it, it pushes the goggle fan to full power, but also have the ability to override the fan setting and increase the pressure on the air inside if you wanted to. This hopefully could help improve the system. About the only other thing I do want to mention that is a shame is the fact that they have removed the power button. It is a little bit confusing with that logo on the side, but it would have been great to have a power button itself there rather than just have to plug in that DC connector. And whilst there are some negatives though, overall I do think they've done a nice job on these goggles. Now the big question people will have is, should I upgrade to these Goggles X if I own a set of V1 Avatar goggles? And for me, the answer to that question is really simple. Do you need analog input without a DVR, and do you need HDMI input? If you don't, there is no good reason today to upgrade to these goggles over these ones. Yes, these do have that Avatar HD 1080p 100 mode, but I personally see no reason that won't come to the original goggles. I don't know if that is the case right now, but there is no technical reason it can't. both have 1080p 100 frames a second displays. The main Avatar RF chipset is exactly the same. What this can do from an Avatar HD point of view, this should be able to do as well. Largely, as I've said several times, the Avatar HD system is the same on these goggles. If you don't need any of that additional I/O, then there is no big reason to run out and upgrade to these goggles. If you're new though and you want to come to Avatar HD, then these are going to be the best option today. But as I've said, on the optics, you could find that it isn't quite as good as the original goggles, but it will depend your face type. What I find is an issue, you may not. The optic side of things is very subjective, and you're going to have to decide depending on what goggle you've got already. Now, you may have noticed a bit of an absence of talking about the new Avatar goggles compared to these, the HDZeros. Now, the reason for that really has been I've been concentrating on these goggles compared to the originals and what they bring to the table. There is, though, a very real conversation to be had on where these goggles stand compared to these, because HDZero did deliver what many, and I have said myself, is probably the perfect option with regards to having a goggle that works with a digital system, HDZero, but also compatibility with other systems as well. The HDZero goggles were the only ones that did offer analog, HDMI in as well as HDMI out. However, today that is no longer the case because Walksnail have delivered something very similar. Now, this conversation, if you're an existing user, is pretty much mute because you're going to go with whatever goggle suits your digital system. But if you are someone sitting on the fence and haven't jumped into digital yet, then choosing between these two is probably where you're going to be at, especially if you want multi-system use. There are upsides and downsides to both of these, and this conversation could easily be half an hour in itself, but I'm going to try and keep it as simple as I possibly can. Both of these goggles will give you HDMI input, HDMI output, analog capabilities, and they both have their own native digital FPV system. For me, the optics are a little bit better on the HDZeros, but it isn't night and day. And really, if you're someone new to FPV, the decision you need to make isn't what goggle to choose, it's what system to choose, and then choose the goggle that uses that. Whilst HDZero does give you the option of putting the VRX module on, now Avatar HD Goggle X gives you the option of using the HDZero module, and you can literally jump between both systems with both of these goggles, no problem at all. The decision on this comes down to the choice between system and not goggle, and then that will lead you to the goggle that you need. It is great to see CaddX bring competition to HDZero on this. Frankly, both of these goggles are very, very good in the respect of I/O and capability, and I don't really think you'll be disappointed with any one that you choose. I'm going to do a much bigger deep dive between these two goggles in the future, but the very basics are they offer very similar specification, very similar capabilities, and the real difference is the system that it uses itself. Now, before this one wraps up, I just want to finish this with some final thoughts on these new goggles, as well as talk a little bit about the Fatshark situation. Now, I've recorded everything you've seen up until now before this point. This is one of the last things that I'm actually recording in this video. I've actually had another probably 20-30 packs on these since doing the testing on the bench, as well as my initial flights. And I have to say, these goggles really are warming on me. I think they're very good. They're not perfect by any means, and I just wish the optics were a little bit better for me, but that isn't a deal breaker for me, and I think this is a very, very good goggle. If you're a new user getting into Avatar HD, as I've already said, it's going to be a no-brainer. I do think it's a mixed bag when it comes to being an upgrade over the original goggles, especially on the Avatar HD side of things. However, if you're someone who wants that I/O, then they're definitely going to give you something you haven't got already. Though they're not going to tick every box for everyone, simply because they don't have that DVR on the analog input. I think CaddX have actually done a really good job here, and it's worth understanding that we believe this is CaddX's first in-house FPV goggle. Their original goggle was designed in partnership with Fatshark. That was sold under the Dominator brand as well as the CaddX brand, whereas today my understanding is this is a CaddX Walksnail product only. We don't know what the situation is with Fatshark, whether the original goggle that they have is going to continue or there's going to be a Fatshark version of this. My understanding is, though, today this is the CaddX goggle and this is how it's going to be for a little while. If this is their first true in-house product, they've actually done a very good job, and whilst they haven't quite got it bang on, it's probably 90% there for most users, and I think that is really quite impressive in itself. I've spent a lot more time on them over the last couple of days, and whilst I have been critical on some elements of the optics, overall none of it's a deal breaker, and these will be the ones that are in my flight bag and not the originals. Now, I really do hope you have found the information in this video useful. It has been a mammoth task for me to get this level of content ready in this time frame. Even though I've had the goggles about a week and a half, I've had multiple firmware updates with things kept changing as I was making this video, and I've had to go back and edit it to include the changes. I really hope it has helped you, and if it has, please do consider checking out the link to my Patreon as well as buy me a coffee in the description, because it's only through the support of my Patreons and the people who support the channel via the donations on Buy Me a Coffee am I able to keep making content like this. I want to say a massive thank you to CaddX for sending these over to me to review. If you're interested, as I've said, in getting a set, there will be a link below. Also, I'm really interested in knowing what you think about these goggles, your thoughts. Please do let me know in the comment section if you have any questions. I will try and answer them below there too. So, that's it. They're available. If you're interested, go get them. They may not be everything everyone wanted, but I do think they're a solid product, and it's great to see the continued evolution of Avatar HD.